17. Countermeasures. Men revolted in earlier ages too, there's nothing rare about such an ado. Strange things pass on earth, as in the sky, how else can the heavenly dog eat the moon on high? In it goes at one side, and out it pops again, brightly as ever the moon shines then. It's always the good who come out on top, the devil's disciples soon have to stop. Landlord Tsui in Wang Ke and Li Xiangxiang. The reaction of the gentry to the devastating blows of the settling accounts movement was as drastic as those who remained behind could make it. As far as the privileged classes were concerned, permanent expropriation was unthinkable. If the peasants could enforce the confiscation of land and property or even double reduction, then life was not worth living. Therefore, even though had been broken, the local peace preservation corps their sword, the provincial and central armies of the Kuomintang their shield, had been cast out, the landlords, the rich peasants, and their tang dogs' legs, inside the liberated areas desperately contested the field. Those who ran away fled with the intention of returning to take revenge, and those who remained used all the resources at their command to disrupt the developing peasant power, neutralize as many people as possible, isolate the active young cadres, and preserve whatever was left of their power and prosperity. They hoped, at a minimum, to have something left to build on when the Great Offensive, being prepared in Chungking with American support, turned the tide of history, crushed the liberated areas, and put the traditional rulers back in power. It never entered their heads that this offensive too would be defeated in the long run. As an elementary precaution, the gentry concealed what valuable property they could in the homes of poor relatives, friends, tenants, and employees. Many peasant families who had little basic sympathy. 161. For the wealthy were cajoled, bribed, tricked, or threatened into helping them. Su Chengpiang, the landlord who was a Kuomintang general, sent his cousin, who was a tenant on his land, $220 silver for safekeeping. The puppet chief of staff Cho Meisheng turned half an acre of his best soil over to a long-term hired laborer, Chang Fuichasan. He also hid $80 silver in a second laborer's house. The latter, Wang Chikao, covered the silver coins with copper ones and set the jar on a shelf. In each case, when the leaders of the Peasants' Association found out about the concealed property, the poor peasants involved were beaten and wholly or partly expropriated themselves. General Su wrote a letter to his cousin asking about the silver dollars. When the letter was intercepted by the village office, it touched off an attack on the cousin himself. Chang Fuichasan, the laborer, was arrested and beaten when the captain of the militia found him planting Cho Meisheng's half-acre with his own seed. Wang Chikao went himself to the Peasants' Association Committee to report the jar full of coins but was beaten nevertheless, for having concealed it. Families such as these were labeled air raid shelters by the other peasants and were mercilessly punished. As a result, persons who, by fair means or foul, had been persuaded to become air raid shelters, tended to be passive, even antagonistic to further struggle because they feared, with reason, that if they were exposed they would be as fiercely attacked as the gentry themselves. They thought, the landlords have put their feudal tails in our homes. When the people come for their property, the landlords may lose their tails, but we will lose our heads. The severe punishment meted out to those who were found out and the fear that this engendered among those already enmeshed suggested to the gentry a new tactic. They converted what began as a movement to hide property into a movement to divide the people. They hid property in others' homes in order to sow distrust and suspicion, in order to divert the attack from themselves and to set the peasants to fighting one another. They even went a step further and spread rumors that they had hidden property with others when in fact they had not. Since a negative is hard to prove, the victims of these rumors found it very difficult to clear their names. As had been demonstrated in the case of C.A. Chunglai's wife, one landlord's word that she had concealed money for Wang Laisun led to a false charge that could fearful beating and flesh-cutting torture, cause that much dissension was more valuable to the gentry than jars full of silver and gold. Coquetry and seduction were also powerful weapons. The women of the gentry were often very beautiful. After all, landlords and rich peasants had long had their pick of the most beautiful girls in the countryside for wives and concubines. In addition to their natural graces, these women were taught to dress and pamper themselves. They knew how to charm men. While the wives of the poor labored endlessly in their huts and in the fields, gathered manure by the roadside, dug herbs in the hills, and were burned black by the sun, the landlord's wives bathed, dressed in elegant clothes, spent hours combing their fine black hair, treated their fair skin with powder and oil, and developed the social graces necessary for entertaining important guests. As the settling accounts movement gathered momentum, the poor laborers who led it suddenly found themselves the objects of solicitous attention, from women who had formerly never so much as glanced at them, much less spoken to them. In Long Bao there was a young hired laborer named Chun-shi who worked for a landlord in the neighboring cow settlement. The family treated him as one of their cattle, lodging him in the stable with the ox and the sheep, and giving him nothing but millet and chaff to eat. During the famine year his own mother appeared at the gate one day to beg for something to eat. When he slipped into the kitchen and took a bowl of millet for her, he was thoroughly beaten for his pains. When his mother came back again he was so afraid of another thrashing that he drove her away. After the liberation of the region, the landlord's daughter-in-law, who had formerly winced when he with his sheep-dung odor went by, suddenly began to flirt with him. She cooked meat dumplings and other delicacies for his dinner, mended his torn clothes, and ultimately invited him to sleep in her quarters. All this was not for nothing, however. As soon as Chun-shi's head was well turned, she persuaded him to hide clothes and other valuable things for her father-in-law. When the peasants of the village launched a sharp attack against the family, which owned over 70 acres and had financed one member through the university at Peking, Chun-shi protected them in every way that he could. When this property finally was divided, the daughter-in-law went out to work as a nurse, only, when the family could no longer afford to hire him did then Chun-shi return to his mother's home in Long Bao. But he took no part in the struggle. He refused to accept any land, houses, or other property in the division then going on and persuaded his mother not to make any accusations because, he said, the Kuomintang would soon be back and punish them all. This type of seduction was repeated many times with many varia. Tie-ins. Even though a number of small exploiters were attacked in Long Bao, there was one rather wealthy family whose property was never seized. This was the family of the widow Yu Puho. There were many reasons for her miraculous immunity but not the least of them was her very beautiful daughter, Pu Chao. This girl had married a poor peasant from a distant village, a former puppet trooper who volunteered for service in the 8th Route Army. After he left for the front she returned home to stay with her widowed mother. As a soldier's wife she was entitled to help from the peasants of Long Bao village. She lost no time in getting acquainted with the village leaders. She carried on flirtations and liaisons with a number of them simultaneously and even bore a son. No one knew who the father was, but since the baby died within a few days his parentage never became an issue. Disarmed by her status as a poor peasant's wife and soldier's dependent, and personally fond of her, the cadres made no move to confiscate her mother's property. A further twist to this motif was the man trap. The landlords used their daughters-in-law to entice the village cadres, encouraged them to sleep together, and then exposed the whole affair to the peasants in an attempt to discredit their leaders and destroy their prestige with the people. Carrying this one step further, they spread rumors about liaisons that did not in fact exist. Simple bribery was another often attempted method. How Xing Qingho came to KTSAI and San Chang with a bag of white flour has already been related. Other landlords did the same but on a more massive scale. They invited every cadre in the village into their homes to eat wheat, definitely a luxury meal, and thrust gifts of clothing, leather shoes, and watches at them. In Long Bao such invitations were not too successful, due in large part to the influence of Teaming, but in Wang village, in the same district, a large proportion of the young men newly catapulted into leadership compromised themselves in this way. Here again, when the gentry were not successful in bribing leaders, they spread rumors to the effect that the leaders had been bribed, mentioned valuable things which they claimed had disappeared from their homes, and in every way tried to discredit the young cadres and cause friction between them and their followers. In Long Bao a big issue was made of the altar lamps, cloth, and candles that were confiscated from the church. Rumor had it that, The altar lamps were made of solid silver, worth some said gold hundreds, perhaps thousands of dollars. Once they left the church they were seen no more, yet no equivalent sum of money or grain found its way into the wealth available for distribution. The truth of the matter was that the lamps were made of brass, not silver or gold. They brought only a modest sum in the Changchi market, and the money had immediately been spent on ammunition and rifles for the militia. In regard to other items that rumor claimed missing, there were also explanations. The cloth had been made into shirts and quilts which were presented free to every volunteer who enlisted in the army. The wax candles were burned by the militia in their temple lodgings since they had no other source of light. But in the absence of a clear accounting, rumors of misappropriation gained wide currency, and the reputation of the village cadres was tarnished accordingly. The most sophisticated tactic used by the gentry was infiltration. Able young men posed as revolutionaries, won the confidence of local party organizations and village governments, and then carried on their wrecking activities from the inside. Although such infiltration was common in the Taihang region, in Longbao no member of any wealthy family attempted such a thing. To the methods of disruption mentioned above must be added the power of the landlord's religious and superstitious authority. As has been pointed out, Confucianism and ancestor worship were deeply ingrained in the consciousness of the majority of the peasants. By claiming that their land and property came from their ancestors and therefore should remain inviolate, the owners caused many a peasant to hold back in the struggle. They also summoned fate to their side once more. If you are poor, that is your fate. That is determined in heaven and no man can go against heaven, they declared, or, if you are poor, that is because your father's tomb is poorly located. No one can defy the influence of air and water. In the face of adversity they preached patience. If one went bankrupt, one could only wait for one's luck to change, select a more suitable spot for one's own grave, and hope that the 8 ideographs of earth and heaven would be in better conjunction when one's son was born. They also prophesied destruction from on high of all those who struggled against the existing order. They said the gods would punish all rebels for their temerity. Can the sun rise in the west? They cried once again, and pointed to the strikingly red sunsets in the summer of 1946 as a portent of the destruction of the Communist Party. To lend weight to such ideas, they used the spirit-talking technique for all it was worth. The return visit, and the distant view, turned out to be highly political. Those peasants who could be enticed into a séance together held up a tray that was sprinkled with a coating of sand. Then a medium, usually a young girl in an induced trance, held a chopstick suspended in her outstretched hand so it just touched the sand. As both the tray and the chopstick moved, lines were drawn in the sand which were immediately interpreted by the master of the séance as ideographs prophesying doom for those who raised their hands against the owners of property. Chiang Kai-shek will return, was another common message. This last idea was the most persistent theme of the landlord's propaganda activity. By spirit talking, by rumor, in conversation, and in public announcements, the gentry stressed over and over again the inevitable return of the Kuomintang and the swift punishment in store for all active participants in the revolution. Weight was given to their words by the activity of the Home Return Corps, a semi-military organization created to take over and hold any area won back from the liberated areas by the nationalist offensives. This corps, composed of landlords' sons, their dogs' legs, hired thugs, and miscellaneous adventurers, instituted a white terror in the wake of the central troops wherever they returned. They hunted down and killed not only active cadres but also their wives, children, and relatives, buried whole families alive, flayed people, and cut off their heads. The Home Return Corps also sent individuals deep into the liberated areas to carry out assassinations, poison wells, loot, kill, and spread panic. Assassinations, carried out at night, were common enough to acquire a name of their own, Black Shots, and there was no person in the revolutionary ranks, no matter how brave, who did not feel a twinge of fear when stepping outdoors after dark or traveling at night on deserted paths between one village and another. To coordinate and direct all the elements of this offensive, the gentry built and rebuilt the Kuomintang Party and tried to maintain underground branches in every village. It was through the party organization that information was gathered about developments in the countryside. Lists of active revolutionary leaders and their peasant supporters were drawn up, money distributed where it would do the most good, and the overall strategy and tactics of the conflict planned and put into practice. This whole effort depended for ultimate success on victories on the field of battle. Such victories could only be won by a strong, well-trained, militant army. With all the manpower of South, Central, and West China to draw upon, with thousands of American officers to train the conscripts, with all the surplus weapons of the Pacific War as their basic armament, and with the arsenals of America pouring in new arms all the time, the gentry felt confident of the future. Should all these fail, America still had, did she not, a monopoly on the atomic bomb? If they could not hold China, then they could destroy her. To meet this many-sided offensive of the gentry, the peasants had Sunrise in the West. 1671 Basic weapon, unity, a weapon which, in the past, they had never been able to forge. That the peasants were able to forge such a weapon after the Second World War and employ it in the face of landlord disruption, terror, and massive, foreign-supported military mobilization was due to one primary factor: the leadership of the Communist Party.